Well, welcome, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time, since The Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside the Tulsa area, a very special welcome to you, and thanks for joining me today. Note that you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes in both audio and video format at my website, carlobroussard.com, under the audio and video tabs. In today's episode, we're going to switch gears a bit from what we normally talk about on the show. Normally, we focus on Catholic Protestant issues, but today we're going to focus on a topic that's an issue within our culture, namely abortion. So we're going to talk a little morality here. The Catholic claim is that abortion is immoral. Now, note this is not just a Catholic claim. This is a claim that can be made by all human beings from the natural light of human reason, so I will argue. But I put the label Catholic there because we're talking about the Catholic reason, where we give claims made by the Catholic Church and reasons behind them. So just a little disclaimer there. So the Catholic claim is that abortion is immoral. And the defense for this claim is as follows. Premise 1, it's always immoral to directly kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, the zygote/embryo/fetus, just different labels for different stages of development for the organism from conception on within utero. So the zygote/embryo/fetus is an innocent human being. Premise 3, abortion involves the direct killing of a zygote/embryo/fetus. And so therefore our conclusion, abortion is immoral. Now, there's no shortage of challenges to this argument from pro-abortion advocates. They do not go down without a fight. Some challenge premise 2 of the pro-life argument, which states that the zygote/embryo/fetus is a human being, by saying that the zygote embryo fetus is not a human being. Now, some recognize that they can't get around the scientific evidence that supports premise 2, that the zygote embryo fetus is a human being. So they take another route and argue that the zygote/embryo/fetus, although a human being, is not a human person. And if not a human person, well, then not deserving of the right to life and its protection under the law. For those who concede that the zygote embryo fetus is a human being and a human person, they still try to challenge premise 2 by arguing the baby in the womb is not an innocent human being. And if not innocent, well, then the mother would be morally permitted to kill the baby. For those pro-abortion advocates who don't want to challenge premises 1 or 2, they set their sights on premise 3 of the argument, which, recall, states abortion involves the direct killing of a zygote embryo or fetus. The challenge here is that some abortions could involve a non-lethal termination of the pregnancy, in which case there would be no direct killing, and thus such an act wouldn't run afoul of the thou shalt not kill innocent human beings premise. Finally, in a last-ditch effort, there are some pro-abortion advocates, and I would say most, who challenge the very first premise that it's always immoral to directly kill an innocent human being. Now, obviously, we can't cover all these challenges in one episode. So the two that I want to focus on are, 1, the challenge that a human being is not necessarily a human person. Remember, there are some who will concede it's a human being according to scientific evidence, but assert that the physical organism from conception on until certain stages of development is not a human person deserving protection of life under the law. So that's a challenge that we want to look at. And then secondly, the challenge that it's not always immoral to directly kill an innocent human being. The challenge to premise one of the pro-life argument. Okay, so let's start with the challenge that the human being is not necessarily a human person. The late Marianne Warren, in her 1973 article published in the Monist Journal entitled On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion, argued that one of the earmarks for determining a human being to be a person is the attainment of, quote, consciousness, and in particular, the capacity to feel pain. This is a common tactic that pro-abortion advocates take to elude pro-life arguments for the immorality of abortion. If a human being before the stage of consciousness, roughly before 24 weeks, isn't a human person, so it's argued, well then it's morally licit to kill it without any moral repercussions. Now, one way to respond to this challenge, which is the response that most give on the popular level, is that all the alternative views for personhood to the traditional view fail. The traditional view being that the physical organism of the humankind is a human person from the moment of conception. Now, all the alternative views, so the argument goes, whether we're talking about the characteristic of consciousness, sentience, viability, or birth, either include beings that we normally don't accept as human persons, or exclude beings that we normally intuitively recognize to be human persons. So that's sort of the popular response to this alternative view. For this type of argument, check out my colleague and good friend Trent Horn's book, Persuasive Pro-Life, which you can get at shop.catholic.com. And he's one of the best in arguing for the pro-life position, and you really can't improve on what Trent does, but he does a great job. Now, that it's the more popular response, that doesn't mean it's bad. Please do not misinterpret me here. And saying that it's the more popular response, I'm not saying that it's bad. It's actually good. And as I mentioned, Horn does a great job in his book, Persuasive Pro-Life. It's just that it's the one that's that people are most familiar with. So again, I simply direct you to read Horn's book. Now, another way to respond is to highlight the implicit assumption that Warren makes about a human being, since Warren's counter-argument that a human being is not a human person until consciousness or the ability to feel pain is only as good as its assumptions. Notice Warren assumes the physical organism that we call a human being can be distinct from a human person, the rational being. This way of thinking is not unprecedented. It has its roots in the writings of Plato and became predominant in modern philosophy with the writings of the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes made this view so popular that it's now known by his name, Cartesian dualism. Descartes taught that the human being is divided into two separate substances: a mental substance, the soul, what is called the res cogitans, and a corporeal substance, the body, res extensa, the extended thing, right? For Descartes, the substance that constitutes who you are as a person is the res cogitans, the thinking self. And rather than the body being essential to a person's identity, as understood in the views of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, it's merely accidental, the body is, not belonging to the essence or the individual identity of the human person. For Descartes, the body is merely a machine in which the soul exists as a complete individual substance, kind of like a ghost, hence the common phrase, a ghost in a machine. Now, it's not difficult to see how Warren's view of the human being smacks of Cartesian dualism. What she calls a human being, or the living physical organism before the attainment of consciousness, is Descartes' res extensa, the body. And this is distinct from what she calls a human person, which is Descartes' res cogitans, the rational substance. For this reason, let's call Warren's hidden assumption the Cartesian assumption. Warren's claim, therefore, is true if and only if the Cartesian assumption is true, that a living human organism, called a human being, a physical organism of the humankind, can be distinct from a human person. Again, that's the assumption. Warren's claim. What was Warren's claim? That a human being before consciousness and the ability to feel pain is not a human person. Well, that's going to be true if and only if the Cartesian assumption is true, that a living human organism can be distinct from a human person. Consequently, if the Cartesian assumption is false, well, then it would be impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say, every human being, no matter the stage of development, would be a human person. And if that's true, well, then it would never be morally licit to kill the unborn, assuming that premise one is true, that it's always immoral to kill an innocent human being. So here's a summary of my argument. Premise one, if Cartesian dualism is false, then it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say the human being in the womb, no matter the stage of development, must be a human person. Premise two, Cartesian dualism is false, so I will argue, therefore, conclusion, it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say, the human being in the womb, no matter the stage of development, from conception all the way through in the womb, that human being must be a human person and therefore deserving of protection of its right to life under the law. My friends, I'm coming up on my first break. Please stay tuned. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. In today's episode, we're focusing on a particular moral issue within our culture, namely abortion, and why we as Catholics, along with any person with the natural light of human reason, is able to come to know that abortion is immoral. We laid out our pro-life argument that premise one, it's always immoral to kill an innocent human being. Premise two, the zygote/embryo/fetus is an innocent human being. Premise three, abortion involves the direct killing of a zygote/embryo/fetus, and so therefore abortion is immoral. Now, one challenge that we've started looking at in segment one was this challenge that a human being isn't necessarily a human person. And we were looking at the claim from the late Marianne Warren, where she says that the human being is not a human person until the moment of consciousness or able to feel pain. And we said how that's going to be true if and only if the Cartesian assumption, what we call Cartesian dualism, is true, namely that you can have a physical human organism, a physical organism of the humankind that is distinct from the rational substance, the rational being, that is the human person. And so my argument in response to the late Marianne Warren, I laid out as follows. Premise one, if Cartesian dualism is false, then it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say, the human being in the womb, no matter what stage of development, must be a human person. Premise two, Cartesian dualism is false, and so therefore our conclusion, it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say, the human being in the womb, no matter what stage of development, must be a human person. Now, since I've already spoken on the justification of premise one of this argument, that if Cartesian dualism is false, then it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. Hopefully that was clear to you. Our task before us is to defend premise two of the argument. That is, Cartesian dualism is false. Now, unfortunately, to do this, we have to dive into some pretty deep philosophical waters. So bear with me, strap on, and I'll do my best to communicate with clarity here. The first argument as to why the Cartesian assumption is false is from the inside, taking sort of a self-reflection as our starting point. Notice that as you listen to me, You sense the words that I am speaking. And at the same time, you understand their meaning. Unless, of course, I'm not expressing myself clearly enough, but hopefully I am. It's not as if you understand the words that you hear, but only the body hears the words. I'm going to repeat that. It's not as if you understand the words that I'm speaking and only your body hears the words. In the technical jargon, there is one subject of action, one agent, you, who both hears and thinks, who is sensing by hearing the words and rationally engaging and conceptually understanding the meaning of the words. It is this fact of human experience that led St. Thomas Aquinas to conclude, and I think his conclusion is correct, that the body is not separate from a person but is essential. Here's what he writes in his Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 76, Article 1. If you are reading, he says this, it is one and the same man who is conscious both that he understands and that he senses. But one cannot sense without a body. And so therefore the body must be some part of man. Again, one and the same man, one agent who is conscious that he is both understanding and sensing. But one can't sense without a body. And so the body must be some part of man. If you're hearing my words right now, and sensing the words and hearing the words involves the body, well, then it necessarily follows that the body is not separate from you like a car is separate from a driver. But the body, with its biological design, is you. In other words, your body, which allows you to sense the words, to hear the words, is essential to your identity as a human person, along with your rational soul that enables you to understand the meaning of the words that you're hearing right now. You're not your soul alone, nor are you your body alone, but you are both body and soul. Philosophers call this view of the human person hylomorphism, Greek for hyle, which means matter, and Greek morphe, which means form. So here's a summary of the reasoning so far in this first argument in response to this first argument for why Cartesian dualism is false. Premise 1, the agent, and again, this is taken from St. Thomas Aquinas, the agent that understands is identical to the agent that senses. Premise 2, the agent that senses is the currently existing physical organism. And so therefore, conclusion 1, the agent, the individual subject that understands, you right now who are understanding, is the currently existing physical organism. Premise 3, if the agent, the individual subject that understands is the currently existing physical organism, then Cartesian dualism is false. Premise 4, the agent, the individual subject that understands is the currently existing physical organism. And that's just a restatement of the first conclusion I made prior. Therefore, conclusion 2, Cartesian dualism is false. Now, when we come back to our main argument against Warren's view of a human being, we have this. Premise 1. If Cartesian dualism is false, well, then it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. Premise 2, Cartesian dualism is false from what we said above or previously, and so therefore it's impossible for a human being not to be a human person. That's to say, the fetus, the zygote, the embryo, or the fetus must be a human person. Now, my second argument against Warren's view of a human being is more metaphysical. It takes a third person point of view by looking at the relation between the body and the soul. Recall the first argument that I gave from St. Thomas Aquinas was started from self-reflection, a conscious experience that I as the agent both understand and sense, or you as the agent, the individual subject, both understands and senses. Here, again, it's more of a metaphysical approach, third-person point of view, looking at the relation between the body and the soul. And here's our starting point. The principle that makes the currently existing physical organism and I'm pointing to a human being here, right? A rational substance. I'll repeat, the principle that makes the currently existing physical organism a rational substance, a person, is identical to the principle that makes this currently existing living organism, again, pointing to a human being, a living organism, i.e. living matter. So I'm going to repeat that. The principle that makes the currently existing living organism a rational substance is identical to the principle that makes this currently existing living organism a living organism, i.e. living matter. Now, I take it here that all on both sides of this debate agree that rationality constitutes personhood. With that assumption, we can move forward. So the question becomes, why should we think the previous claim is true? Namely, the principle that makes the currently existing living organism a rational substance is identical to the principle that makes this currently existing living organism a living organism, i.e. living matter. Well, I'm sure you'd agree with me that there's a difference between living matter, a living organism, say a tree, and non-living matter, like a rock, and that there must be some differentiating factor, a principle by which the tree is living rather than not. If there's nothing to make them different, well, then they would be the same, which is contrary to fact. Now, the principle by which the living matter is living must be something other than matter. Otherwise, the living matter, the tree, would be different than or from the non-living matter, the rock, on account of that which by which they were the same, namely matter. But that's absurd, right? Two things can't be different on account of that in virtue of which they are the same. So the differentiating factor must be something other than matter. Again, otherwise they would be different on account of that in virtue of which they are the same, which is absurd. Let's call this non-material differentiating factor between living matter and non-living matter a soul, that by which the tree is living matter, having an active life, rather than non-living matter, having no active life. Now, the tree's act of living has wrapped up within it a variety of other acts or operations. That's to say, insofar as the tree is alive, it acts in certain ways and has certain powers. It sinks roots into the ground, grows upward toward light, sends branches out from its trunk on which leaves grow, and it performs photosynthesis. Since the tree's soul is the principle that accounts for its active life, and that active life has wrapped up within it these other actions, given the kind of thing it is, it follows that the tree's soul also is the principle for these other actions. In other words, the tree's soul doesn't merely account for the tree being alive, but also all of its other tree-ish operations. And so the question now becomes, well, what about a human being? Well, in order to answer that question, my friends, we're going to have to wait until the other side of the break. So please don't go anywhere. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. More to come on the other side of the break as to why the principle that accounts for the currently existing physical organism to be a rational substance is identical to the principle that accounts for the currently existing physical living organism to be a living organism. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in Eastern Oklahoma. In today's episode, we're switching gears and looking at an issue that pertains to morality and culture, since it's a hot-button moral issue within our culture, namely abortion. And the pro-life argument is that it's always wrong to kill an innocent human being. The zygote/embryo/fetus is an innocent human being. Abortion involves the direct killing of a zygote/embryo/fetus, and so therefore abortion is immoral. Now, one challenge that we've been looking at so far in today's episode is the idea that the human being, from the moment of conception in its various stages initially, although may be a human being, is not a human person. And so therefore, at certain stages of development, would not have a right to life and therefore need to be protected, have its life protected under the law. And the late Marianne Warren was an example par excellence of this, arguing that the human being is not a human person until the moment of consciousness or ability to feel pain. And we pointed out how that argument or that assertion would be true if and only if the Cartesian assumption embedded within it were true, namely that you can have a physical organism, a human being of the a physical organism of the humankind, a human being that is distinct from and not a human person, the rational substance. And so the argument is that if Cartesian dualism is false, well, then it would be impossible to have a physical organism of the humankind, namely a human being, that is not a human person. And so I was offering some arguments to show why Cartesian dualism is false. One of which, taken from St. Thomas Aquinas, is that the individual subject or the agent is conscious of being the subject of action, the agent that acts, as both understanding and sensing. So as you hear me right now, you simultaneously understand the meaning of my words, hopefully, and hear my words. But you can't hear or sense without the body, and so therefore, as Aquinas concludes, the body must be essential to who you are as an individual human person. The very agent that understands is the agent that senses, thereby proving that the human organism, the physical organism of the humankind, is identical to the agent that understands, the rational substance, the human person. Now, the second argument that I was proposing is a bit more metaphysical, and that is from the relation of the soul and the body. And the starting point that I was articulating in the prior segment is that the principle that makes the currently existing physical organism, and we're pointing to a human being here, right? The principle that makes the currently existing physical organism a rational substance, that is a human person, is identical to the principle that makes this currently existing physical organism a living organism, i.e. living matter. And I started out, in order to justify this principle, I started out with a tree, right? And just articulating the soul, you have a difference between living matter, non-living matter. There's got to be a differentiating factor lest they be the same. Since they're not the same, the differentiating factor must be present, and it can't be matter because the two cannot be the principle and virtue of which they are the same, namely matter, can't be that on account of which they are different. That's absurd. And so the differentiating factor that makes the living matter living, in the case of the tree, must be a non-material principle to it. And we call that the soul. And that's the term that Aristotle gave it. That on account of which living matter is living, differentiating it from non-living matter. And with that living matter, with that act of life that the tree has, are all these other tree-ish operations. And so the principle that accounts for the act of life for the tree is at the same time identical to the very principle that accounts for all of the tree-ish actions or operations. Now, I left off before our last break with the question, well, what about a human being? Human beings are living organisms as well. And so therefore, humans must have a soul, a principle by which they are living matter and not non-living matter. And like the tree, humans have an active life that has wrapped up within it a variety of other actions or operations. Some are had in common with the tree, such as taking in nutrients and growth. The powers that enable humans to perform these actions are called vegetative powers, which trees have as well, and plants. Unlike the tree, however, humans see, hear, and taste, which means humans are sentient or animals. The powers that enable humans to perform these actions are called sensitive powers. A human, at least in the more mature stages of development, also engage in thought processes that are conceptual in nature. We call that reasoning, and freely choose some goods over others. The powers that enable humans to perform these actions or operations are intellect and will, called rational powers. Since a human soul is the principle that accounts for its act of living, And that act of life necessarily involves other actions that go with being human, growing, sensing, and reasoning, along with the powers from which these acts proceed, vegetative, sensitive, and rational. It follows that the human's soul is also the principle that accounts for these actions that go with being human, along with the powers from which these actions proceed. In other words, a human soul is the principle that accounts for it being the living organism that it is, with its vegetative powers and actions, and at the same time, the principle that accounts for it being an animal with a rational nature, with its sentient powers and actions and its rational powers and actions. That's to say, a person. So our claim that I articulated at the beginning is true. The principle that makes this currently existing existing living organism, pointing to a human being, a rational substance, a person, the principle that makes that living organism a person is identical to the principle that makes this currently existing living organism, again pointing to a human being, a living organism. The principle is the same. There is a single principle on account of which the physical living organism of a humankind is a human organism and also a human person, that is, a rational substance. Now, the principle that currently makes a human living organism his soul was present the moment the human was conceived, since, as science confirms, and we're going to do an episode on this later, from the moment of conception, a human is a living organism. If a human soul accounts for it being a living human organism now, and science tells us a human was a living organism from the moment of its conception, well, then it follows that a human soul was present from the moment of its conception. In fact, it's the overwhelming scientific testimony for the presence of a living human organism from the moment of conception that leads pro-abortion advocates to make the Warren-type argument in the first place. They can't deny it's a human being. They can't deny it's a physical organism of the humankind. And so now we can begin to connect the dots. Given what we've already said, a human soul simultaneously makes it both a living human organism and a rational substance. That's to say, a person. That very soul is present from the moment of a human's conception. Therefore, from the moment of a human's conception, a human isn't merely a living organism, but a living organism of a rational nature, with rational powers and the potential to engage actually in the rational activities at later stages of development. In short, a human being is a human person from the moment of conception. What this means is that Warren's Cartesian assumption is false. Recall, the Cartesian assumption asserts that a living human organism can be distinct from a human person. But we've just shown this is impossible. Therefore, a human being, no matter the stage of development, is a human person, as they say, from the womb to the tomb. And if a human being is a human person, no matter the stage of development, well then it's never morally licit to kill the unborn. Why? Because when that living human organism is within the womb, that living human organism, no matter the stage of development in the womb, is a human person. And it's never morally licit to kill an innocent human person. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction of today's episode, some are even willing to challenge the premise that it's always wrong to kill an innocent human being. So somebody might respond and say, well, fine, maybe the human being from the moment of conception is a human person, and I'll acknowledge that. But that first premise of the pro-life argument, that it's always wrong, morally illicit to kill an innocent human being, that's something that I'm not in agreement with. So here's a few examples of some pro-abortion advocates who make this claim. Consider, for example, Judith Jarvis Thomson. In her 1971 article, A Defense of Abortion, published in Philosophy and Public Affairs, she explicitly denied the idea that, quote, directly killing an innocent human person is always and absolutely impermissible. She denied that position, calling that premise or that proposition false. She argued that killing the embryo in the womb, which she conceded is plausibly a human person from conception, is permitted in order to save the mother's life. One named Sophie Lewis is another example. The title of her 2022 Nation article says it all. Here's the title: Abortion Involves Killing, and That's Okay. She adopts a quote from Maggie Nelson in the Argonauts. Here's the quote: Feminists may never make a bumper sticker that says it's a choice and a child. But of course, that's what it is, and we know it. We're not idiots, she says. We understand the stakes. Sometimes we choose death, like in the case of mothers living in unspeakable conditions who kill their children as an act of mercy. Now, everything I say here in my response is in written form in my article at Catholic.com, what if it's okay to kill innocent people. But before we go into the details, I'm going to have to take a break here. Talk to you on the other side. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we are looking at the issue of abortion and its morality. The pro-life position is that it is immoral. Pro-abortion advocates have several challenges to the pro-life argument: that it's always wrong to kill an innocent human being, and that the zygote embryo/fetus is indeed a human being. And the particular challenge we've been looking at so far in today's episode is the challenge that a human being, although some will concede it's a physical organism of a humankind from the moment of conception, isn't necessarily a human person, and thus deserving of the protection of its right to life. And we gave reasons why that is false, giving arguments why its inherent assumption, namely the Cartesian assumption, is false, and why it is impossible for a human being to not be a human person. That's to say, a human being, no matter what stage of development, from the womb to the tomb, is a human person, and therefore concluding abortion is always immoral. Now, before our last break, we teed up this challenge to premise one of the pro-life argument, that it's always immoral to kill an innocent human being. Some will say, well, not always. In some cases, it's morally permitted, like, for example, to save a mother's life. And so my response to this challenge is in written form in my article at Catholic.com, What if it's okay to kill innocent people? And so what I'm going to share with you here is in written form there, and I'd encourage you to check it out. But here's my response. So we need to be able to justify the premise of the pro-life argument that it is always immoral to kill an innocent human being. How might we justify or defend that premise? Well, let's start with this major principle. Let's call it the natural principle. You're a human being, and as a human being, there's stuff that belongs to you. It's what makes your nature as a rational animal, and therefore it's natural to you. And whatever is necessary for you to have that stuff that belongs to you as a human being, that necessary stuff, the prerequisites, are also natural to you. St. Thomas Aquinas puts it this way in his Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 129. Whenever a certain thing is natural to any being, that without which this certain thing cannot be possessed must also be natural, for nature is not defective in regard to necessary things. Consider, for example, that we are by nature social, rational animals. We're not islands unto ourselves. So whatever is necessary, a prerequisite for us to live as social, rational animals, you might say the prerequisites for living as social animals, is also going to be natural to us. To deny this would make about as much sense as deploying a soldier to fight with no weapons. It's the nature of soldiering to fight, and fighting requires weapons. So weapons, just like fighting, are natural to doing what a soldier does. What you need to do soldiering, what you need to soldier, in verb form there, is also natural to soldiering. What is necessary so the question becomes, what is necessary for us to live as social animals, to live among other rational animals? Well, folks, at a minimum, refraining from killing each other. That's to say, as Aquinas puts it in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 128, ordered harmony. That's required for us to live out nature's design for our perfection as social animals. You can't follow nature's command to pursue your perfection as a social rational animal if I kill you, nor can I if you kill me. The natural order, therefore, entails that each of us be equal in behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of living, what Aquinas calls in his Summa Theologiae in part 2, the second part of the second part, question 79, article 1, equality of relations. A behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of living, the equality of relations. So this equality of relations, at least with regard to behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of life itself, is natural to us too. Remember, what the prerequisite is, what is necessary for social rational living is also natural to us. Equality of relations is a prerequisite for social rational living. And so equality of relations is going to be natural to us. It's nature's plan, order, or blueprint. It's a major part of nature's recipe for human happiness and perfection. The equality of relations, that is, behavior that's naturally consistent with exercising our life of living as social rational animals. Now, here's where the concept of innocent comes into play. Being equal in behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of living is just another way of saying the natural order entails that social rational animals be innocent in their relation with one another, primarily in behavior. The behavior itself, even if the person is innocent in will, for example, a crazy person who's lost his mind and is not culpable for his behavior, the behavior itself must be consistent with what human nature demands for the equality of relations among human beings. So innocence, at least in behavior, is essential to the equality of relations. So that's the natural principle. Whatever is a prerequisite for that which is natural to us is also natural to us. Now let's consider our other major principle, the justice principle. Whatever is natural to man is due to him. Suppose our country is in famine, and I happen to be well stocked with food and a starving man visits me. Given that food is natural to him as a human being, food is due to him. And seeing that there's no way for him to acquire that which is natural to him on his own, namely food, I would need to give him some. How much? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and it goes beyond the scope of what I can say here. But we can say this much. To give him no food in my circumstances of abundance, that would be an injustice. I would be depriving him of what is due to him. In this moment, it falls to me to give this human being his due, whether I like it or not. Now, I've already articulated that the equality of relations among human beings, or what Aquinas also calls ordered harmony, which at a minimum requires equality in behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of living, me not killing you and you not killing me, is natural to us as social rational animals. I repeat that. The equality in behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of living, me not killing you and you not killing me, is natural to us as social rational animals. I also showed that such equality in behavior is another way of describing innocent behavior. So given the principle above, or given the principle I articulated before, it follows that being equal in behavior that's naturally consistent with the exercise of life itself, being innocent in our behavior, is due to each of us. This is why Aquinas writes that equality in our relations with others, the peace or ordered harmony among human beings, is the equality of justice. He writes about this in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, question 79, article 1. So here's a summary of our reasoning so far. What is natural to us, what is natural to human beings is due to them in justice. Premise 2. Equality of relations, i.e. innocent human behavior, refraining from killing each other, is natural to human beings. And so therefore the conclusion is equality of relations, that is to say, innocent human behavior, refraining from killing each other, is due to human beings in justice. Now, to deliberately kill an innocent human being, a person whose behavior is naturally consistent with the exercise of my life, is to violate the equality of relations that is due to him. The killer is no longer equal with the other in behavior. And since such equality is naturally due to an innocent human being, it's what human nature requires, it follows that to deliberately kill an innocent human being is to violate nature's plan or order of justice. It would be an injustice on two counts: an injustice done to the innocent human being, and at the same time, a voluntary failure on the part of the killer to uphold justice, a voluntary failure to give what is naturally due to his fellow man. Since to behave in a way that thwarts or violates nature's order or plan for the perfection of human beings is immoral behavior, it follows that to directly kill an innocent human being is immoral. And thus, the "thou shalt not kill the innocent" imperative is justified. It's grounded and it's rooted in nature's order or plan for human behavior. That is premise one of the overall pro-life argument. So we can summarize our entire argument as follows. Premise one: an act that violates what is due to a human being, that is, an act that violates the order of justice, is an unjust or immoral act. Premise two: direct abortion is an act that violates what is due to a human being, namely the equality of relations. And so therefore, direct abortion is an unjust/immoral act. And it is intrinsically so, regardless of intention, regardless of circumstances. Even if, as hard as it is to save a mother's life, say, it is always immoral to directly kill an innocent human being. And in this case, always immoral to kill the unborn, because the unborn is an innocent human being. Well, my friends, that brings us to the end for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today is that abortion is immoral. And the claims that seek to say a human being can be something other than a human person, and that sometimes it's okay to kill an innocent human being, are false. Both of those challenges are indeed false. And so the pro-life argument, therefore, still succeeds and stands up against at least these two challenges. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, there is a host of other challenges that pro-abortion advocates pose to various premises in the pro-life argument. And we're going to save those challenges for another episode. We will indeed come back to those challenges, assess them, and see whether they succeed or not. But until then, you're just going to have to wait for it, my friends. Friends, thank you so much for listening to The Catholic Reason, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcasts. Note that you can also access the archived episodes in both video and audio format at my website, carlobroussard.com. Just look under both the audio and video tabs. I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.